Shakespeare developed the wonderful film that we've just watched together. So thank you so much, Helen, for being here.
Well, thank you for organizing the event and inviting me.
Of course. Um, well, the first thing actually in our email correspondence that struck me was, you had wanted to be here at this time and showing the film in person, right? And we're doing this virtually, which we're so grateful for you to be here for. But I certainly learned a bit as you explained the reasons why you couldn't be here, and I think it ties into some of the thematics in the film. If you'd want to share a bit about that.
Yeah, so the as you probably all know, in addition to passing 243 new sanctions, actions, and measures to tighten the US blockade of Cuba under the Trump administration, a few days before Trump left office, he very vindictively returned Cuba back onto the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And I mean, this is absurd. Even people from the State Department have come out and said, no one believes that's true. This is just a political maneuver. And obviously, Trump was lining up the possibility of a return and the importance of winning the election in Florida. So what that meant under the Biden administration, they have now declared that because Cuba is on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, anyone who is from a country where they are normally not required to apply for a visa to enter the United States. They apply for something called the ESTA visa waiver program. So that's all the countries in the European Union plus others. We can normally go online, apply for the visa waiver and get it immediately. But when I applied, the intention was to do a bit of a speaking tour in the United States in the spring, and I was rejected, and I had no idea why until it became public that now this is the law. So if if you're a British citizen and you've been to Cuba even for a beach holiday, let alone to find out and research and publish on how Cuban socialism functions, then you will be automatically at this point denied the right to visa waiver. So I am still applying for a visa to visit the United States. And in the meantime, thankfully, we've all got used to Zoom and similar online, ways of having virtual meetings. So I've been doing a lot of that. And I'm quite used to being up it's now 1:45 in the morning.
Well, we certainly appreciate you adapting to those challenging circumstances and appreciate you being up at this time. Are you are what is is this something that is affecting like all academics like yourself similarly, or does the United States have, because I with the U.S. blockade, certainly there are countries that benefit more from a better relationship with the U.S. And I'm wondering if there are disparities among countries or institutions where people don't have that same kind of issue.
Well, from what I understand, this is affecting, it's not just academics. As I said, it's,
Right.
I'm starting to hear stories now about, for example, a group that went from Europe to Cuba, and their plane went through Miami. And then when they went to leave Cuba and return on the same flight through Miami, they found that they were not able. So all sorts of problems are coming up. And I think it's quite clear that this is another mechanism to try to starve Cuba from a very important source of revenue.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, speaking of your screening events and attempts to share and successes in sharing the film globally, I'm wondering a bit if you could share some of the reception that the film has gotten. Where have you screened it? Because I know for myself, in watching this film, I go, of course, of course we need to be taking these measures. Of course we need to be prioritizing human lives over profit. And the Cuban state is such a wonderful example, as you've so deftly displayed. So how do you present this film in different settings, and what have those receptions been?
Okay, so the film was originally produced with funding from the University of Glasgow, because Glasgow, that's where I work, and of course Glasgow was hosted COP26. So, the university was quite keen to have a university contribution. So, we originally just made the documentary to premiere on the first day of COP, and it premiered in the university. But this is something we weren't expecting, but we were obviously delighted because the whole of the official Cuban delegation that was in Glasgow for COP attended the premiere, including the Minister of Science, Technology and the Environment, who's absolutely a key person in Tarea Vida.
Yeah.
So we didn't know what they would make of it at all, and I invited the minister to speak at the end, and she was very moved by the documentary. So that was great because it was a completely independent piece of work, apart from the fact that we interviewed people who were involved in different ways. Subsequently, the documentary has been screened on Cuban national television. It's also been screened on a US channel, Free Speech TV, and we've been really bowled over by the reception it's had. We released it on YouTube, so it would be freely accessible to anyone with access to YouTube. And we currently have subtitles in English and Spanish, Arabic, French, Dutch, and we're hoping to get soon German and Greek. And if anyone in the audience has another language, they can contribute. And it's also been picked up by quite a few environmental festivals worldwide. I think it's 6 now that have selected the documentary, which is absolutely great. And then last month, I went to the European Union and we did a screening in the European Union as part of the preparations of the left group in the EU Parliament for COP27. And then, the people who hosted it flew off the next day to COP27 in Egypt.
Wow.
So yeah, it's been an incredible reception, and I love the fact that people are still screening it, even though it's available. You can sit at home, watch it on your mobile phone, but obviously it's always much better to watch it in a communal, collective environment where we can have discussions afterwards. And because I think, I hope the documentary has left you all with a lot to think about.
Yeah, of course. Something else that makes me think of too is, this documentary is clearly a very powerful tool that, proponents of Tarea Vida and also the end of the Cuba blockade can use to advocate for those things. And something I want to know more about is what power does Cuba have to advocate for itself on the global stage, in venues where this film may make an appearance, or, ministers of Cuba who are able to show this kind of evidence, and where is that power limited?
Yeah, we have to be clear that the US blockade of Cuba, or as some people say, embargo, um, is isn't just economic from financial and trade blockade. It does include censoring, developments in Cuba, particularly positive developments, and also trying to, undermine the results. So, Cuba did remarkably well in terms of containing COVID-19, even despite the surge in summer 2021. It had incredibly low rates of contagion and fatality comparatively, but you wouldn't think that really if you if you read the US media. And I think so it is really important to put aside, in a sense, the polemic and the ideology, and actually, I'd encourage everyone to go out to Cuba with their own research questions and see what they find. But I think that, the interesting thing is that while Cuba is, sort of ostracized by the advanced capitalist countries or the imperialist countries, it actually has phenomenally good relationships of cooperation and communication with most of the global South. So within COP, the UN Conference on Climate Change conferences, Cuba participates in several different multilateral organizations. So it participates in the less developed countries group. It participates in ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. It participates in a much broader group of the other groups that come together in the group of 77 plus China. And they represent the vast majority of the global population, and certainly the part of the global population which is most affected already by climate change, not as some hypothetical future, but as a thing that is threatening their survival today. So, what I was hearing about when the delegation was in Glasgow was how that they coordinate between these groups. The CARICOM, the Caribbean Community Nations, is another one. And of course, they're also small island developing states, which are in the front line of climate change. Because if you think about it, like the United States and Britain and other European countries can flood these conferences. They can ensure that they dominate every single forum. There's multiple meetings happening at the same time. But Cuba was only able to send four official delegates to COP. So they don't have the capacity to have a counter voice and to push the agenda of Cuba, of the small island developing states, and so on in every forum, unless they work together and they work collectively. So I do think that there is knowledge. And in the words of Orlando Rey, who was the guide and advisor to the Minister of SITMA, the Ministry of Science, Technology and Environment, as he said in an interview I did with him after making the documentary, that other countries and representatives are finding out about Tarea Vida, and they are very impressed, not just with the plan itself, but the fact that Cuba has the capacity and the resilience and the creativity and the scientific capacity, which is extraordinarily important. It really is the axis of Tarea Vida, to come up with such an ambitious and comprehensive plan. And I think although there's a discussion towards the end of the documentary about, how useful is this as a model to other countries, given that Cuba is exceptional in the sense that they have a socialist development model. And this is a question in terms of the influence that Tarea Vida can have, what other countries can take as a lesson from Tarea Vida. But I think that there are key approaches within Tarea Vida which we could regard as lessons for a broader audience, for the global South. And those are, to summarize massively, the fact that government policy is based on the science. It's led by the scientists, and environmental scientists are at the heart of policy making. That's absolutely important. The second thing is that the Cubans, partly obliged by the US blockade, which, by the way, many people don't realize, part of the sanctions against Cuba stop Cuba from being able to join multilateral development banks, to be able to, as most countries in a crisis like in COVID-19 or a crisis after a hurricane, most countries can get a loan. They have a lender of last resort. Cuba doesn't have that. So this is one of the constraints which has forced the Cubans to really focus on natural solutions and national solutions. So in terms of climate change, a natural solution is, for example, planting or sowing mangroves along the coast, because they have a really good utility in protecting the coastlines and mitigating the rising seawater levels. And national solutions, so their capacity to respond and to develop policy doesn't depend on finances from abroad, which are often sort of portrayed as if they are contributions or donations, but actually they're loans that have to be repaid. So that's the second important thing. And the third important element is that Tarea Vida depends on community mobilization and participation. So it just has to have the engagement, involvement, and of local people, and local communities actually appropriate the scientific knowledge, and they use their local knowledge. And I was given examples of sometimes they've gone into very vulnerable coastal villages or towns and stuff, and they are proposing that these people will have to locate. But in conversation with the local community, they have come up with some creative solutions that has meant that at least in the interim period, they're going to be able to remain where they are.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that response. Definitely some like really big takeaways from this film that we have to fight for tooth and nail and piecemeal here in the U.S. and in imperial countries, and so it's so refreshing and beautiful to see it sort of packaged up in your film. Thank you for that. Um, I'll ask one more question before opening it up to the audience if there are any audience questions. Um, my question is, there's a scene where you approach a couple men sitting on the by the coast on the beach, and you don't open up the conversation mentioning climate change. You ask about sea level rise and how the homes are affected, but immediately they respond with if the climate keeps changing, this is the situation we'll be in, and that used to be where I lived. And so I was really struck by how, like you said, it really requires the buy-in and the belief, right? Or the non-denial, maybe I should say, of everybody in the nation. And so I'm curious a little bit about how you perceived climate change sort of rhetorically passing around Cuba, where that buy-in can exist, where that actually belief in this as an issue and something that needs to be addressed can result in such fruitful collaboration between communities.
Yeah, I mean, look, from the perspective of the Cuban population, they can feel climate change. As I said, it's not a hypothetical future danger in the future. It's already hitting them. So between 2001 and 2017, they had an unprecedented nine, top category or very, at least very, very hard hurricanes that hit Cuba. And, each hurricane is massively disruptive because the Cubans don't just leave people to resolve their own survival. They evacuate people. They even evacuate cattle, to protect their sort of economic resources and food supply and so on. And then, as quick as they can, they're reestablishing electricity and so on and so forth. And I think maybe you and your audience will be aware of the terrible hurricane that hit Pinar del Rio just recently in September. And, it was unprecedented, I think, how long it took to reestablish electricity because the level of damage is so massive, but also because infrastructure is so run down and the electrical system is at exhaustion point anyway. And, the Cubans can't get the maintenance and the spare parts that they need. Again, going back to the US blockade, unfortunately, everything tends to go back to the US blockade. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I never thought about that. The fact that we don't go up and say, "Hi, we're making a film about climate change," but that's what it is for them. That with the sea coming in and destroying the homes. I mean, I was really shocked. I was standing there on that coastline. I'd heard about it, but I'd never seen it. And just looking up and down and just seeing all these abandoned buildings, it really struck me. And this this very stubborn man who just refused to leave the area. Yeah, I mean, you have to also appreciate that there is a massive education campaign going on, and it's coordinated at every level. So all of the institutions of the state practically and all of the ministries are somehow coordinating with Tarea Vida. So even the Radio and Television Institute, they're part of Tarea Vida. Their role within it is to maintain a constant flow of information and really convince people. I think one of the most interesting things is when Orlando Rey says, we have to convince people that climate change is not just a meteorological incident, it's not just a hurricane or a flood, but it is actually a transition in the complete climate that we live in. Obviously, before we did the documentary, I'd done some reading from, Cuban, from the Ministry of Science, Technology and the Environment, from Cuban meteorologists, I hate saying that word, and climate scientists. And I was reading this stuff going, oh my God, this is really scary, the prospects, the projections that Cuba's facing. A country, and if any of you have been to Cuba, how to what extent staple foods are rice, pork, sugar, obviously. And these are all things that are being threatened because of a complete change in climate, not just because of a hurricane or, what a one-off meteorological incident. So, it's something that they are going to have to deal with. But what's distinctive about Cuba is that they have a welfare a development model that puts human welfare first, and they've long since realized that human welfare depends on the environment as well. In fact, Cuba was one of the first countries in the world to incorporate environmental concerns in its constitution, and that was back in 1976. So before the famous blockade report, which was the report, the first sort of major international report produced by the United Nations, which was, I think, 1982 or 1983, but it used this term sustainable development and popularized that term. And the Cubans were already, promoting the concept that the state and the population are responsible for caring for the environment, and that was indistinguishable from the welfare of the population. So education is really important. That's sort of media education. It's also in schools. So from every year group in schools are receiving lessons about climate change and about the need for environmental protections.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it almost sounds, trite at this point to say, but like, if only, right? If only that kind of media and education were widely available as well, where, everywhere where climate change affects humans, which is everywhere. Um, well, at this point, I'd like to open it up if anyone in the audience does have questions for Helen. Now is a good time to pose them if anyone has questions. If not, I have one more.
I'd love to hear from the audience, even if they would just say what they thought of the documentary. I've stayed up till 1 a.m. to hear.
Thank you. Not a question necessarily, but I I have looked into the idea of donut economics, as well as a circular economy. So I'm interested to see or learn about your perspective and how that plays into the structure that Cuba is developing for climate with Tierra Vida, is it? Yeah.
You're going to have to explain donut economics to me.
So the concept is that we look at economics not in the prospects of prosperity or like growth, right? We try to look at growth, economic growth differently, where we take into account social issues, right? Environmental issues, climate change. And we measure it in terms of boundaries or planetary boundaries, right? And if at some point like poverty levels are going up, or access to food, or access to land, education, gender equality, like taking into account all of these issues, and pairing it together to truly measure how well the economy is doing. And within that, I'm sure I'm not explaining it right either. It's like a big concept, and it's new to me. But it takes into account the role of climate change within all of those roles, right? So it's a different way of looking at economic prosperity in a country. But it seems like Cuba is also taking into account those societal issues and pairing it together with climate change solutions.
Okay, so yeah, I have heard of people talking about this donut economics. I mean, I think the question is, you when you explained it, you said we measure, the effects of climate change. We. So my question is, who's the we? You see, because I think that the big issue here is about ownership and the function of production, control of production, and distribution and consumption. So, I remember going to my first lesson in economics at A level, which is what we call it here when it's pre-university. First lesson in economics. And the lesson that I was given was that companies only produce to make a profit. So, there I was thinking, wow, that's socialist economics right out the window. It doesn't even exist in this classroom. So if companies only produce to make a profit, that you're talking essentially about private interests. So how can private interests be persuaded to consider the impact of their activities on the environment or on gender equality or on levels of exploitation or mental health or whatever it is? How can they be persuaded to do that? And that's why I'm saying the question is the we. Who has control of production, distribution, and consumption? And I think that really the question is one of ownership and power and production for what purpose. So under capitalism, essentially, and this is a crude definition, it's production in pursuit of private profit. So you have social wealth, things that we produce to exchange socially that you can't, it's not subsistence. You're producing stuff to exchange in society, but it's the wealth that is produced is appropriated privately. And in socialism, the idea is that you have production to meet people's needs. And that's the only system, arguably, that actually can contemplate the cost of productive activity on the environment, on people's mental health, on gender equality, and all the other issues. So I think this is really key. You see, another thing that's absolutely distinctive about Tarea Vida, the state plan, is in the title. It's a state plan. And actually, it doesn't incorporate private interests. So, I mean, they are, opening up more spaces for small private businesses in Cuba and so on and so forth. But it's not like one of the most plans. Whenever you talk here, certainly our governments speaking about climate change, they're talking about how they can get the private sector on board, how they can incentivize certain behaviors or use regulation. But we know what will happen, right? The successful business people will find ways or seek ways to avoid regulation, to evade regulation. Why? Because it eats into their profit margins. So, if that's their purpose of setting up a business, as I was told in my A-level economics class, then the two things are irreconcilable. And, it's clear why Lando Rey makes those points towards the end of the documentary. Yeah. Because also, we cannot disengage the issue of climate adaptation and mitigation from the issue of global and structural poverty. If you go back and look at the full speech, we just had extra excerpts of the speech that Fidel Castro gave in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, very, very early on. We had the 30th anniversary this year. And he was already making very clear the links between the histories of colonialism and imperialism, the development of capitalism, the development of consumer societies, the fact that a lot of the wealth that they used to develop came from the global south, came from the colonized countries and former colonized countries, and the poverty that has engendered in those countries, the structures of poverty, that patterns and chains that cannot be broken. And he was linking those to the question of the environment. And I think it is very hard. Like, let me give you an example. Today, a lot of people in the advanced capitalist countries are more or less proposing that what we need to do is just shift all of our energy production to renewable energy sources, right? So the problem is not the level of consumption. The problem is not our standards of living or the waste. The problem is how the energy is generated. But as Orlando Rey also says in the documentary, there is not the space on Earth to set up the technology for renewable energies, for the wind turbines and the solar panels, to continue to consume at the level that we are. And that is a model for the countries that are developing, like China. I mean, can you imagine if everyone in China gets a car, let alone two, which I believe is, closer to the US model? So, but in addition to that, where do these metals come from that we need? Where do the special metals come from? Well, we know that they come from the same countries that were subject to centuries of colonialism and imperialist exploitation. And we can already see how that is panning out for those countries, right? In Bolivia, what was it, 2019, when Evo Morales was effectively removed in a coup. It's known as the lithium coup because what happened, right? Evo Morales, the country's first indigenous president, leader of the movement towards socialism, he had just declared that Bolivia would not open up its lithium reserves to private US interests, right? So, we can also see that similar, battles are starting to take place over control of lithium and similar metals in other developing countries. So I think that this is the challenge, right? We have to get a message across that it is not going to be possible to save the planet and its population by maintaining the same standard of living and the same levels of consumerism that we have. We will not in any way reverse the inequality, global inequality that has seen, tens of thousands of people every year trying to get to wealthier countries because their lives are unsustainable and unbearable where they are. We've just had a horrible incident in Britain, in the weather that we have at the moment. I mean, I'm in Glasgow. I'm like this because it's -4, and we've had, a boat, a dinghy, basically a dinghy with 50 migrants desperate to get to Britain over the frozen seas, and it collapsed. And this kind of thing is going to carry on and carry on because there are already millions of climate migrants, people being forced to flee for economic and climatic reasons. And really the two are inseparable, because where you see the worst devastation of environments, when forests have been chopped down to make soya plantations, then you get mudslides, then you get people pushed out of their homes. So I think that we need something much more profound and much more structural than donut economics. And I think we need to deal with the question of, who controls production, who controls distribution, and who controls consumption, and in the interests of whom.
Thank you so much for that response. Are there any other questions from our audience or comments to discuss? Cool. Move it there. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say I came in late, but it was great what I saw. I love the documentary. I just came in to look at the bookstore and I got this great documentary. So thank you for that.
Love that. Thanks so much for coming and for viewing. Cool. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up our screening and Q&A. Helen, thank you so much for being here, and for joining us. Again, it's late over there in Glasgow, so we appreciate it so much. Thank you, and thank you for your wonderful film. I'm certainly walking away with so much new knowledge and new inspiration.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing the event and for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Have a great night.
Bye.
That concludes the Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and have a great night. There's actually something that I need to something must plug, because as we started the conversation up with Dr. Yap, she mentioned that she wasn't able to enter the country as a function of